I have a book called Client-Centered Therapy by Carl Rogers, and I never read all of it. I read bits, and there was this one bit in it that says, in order for a behavior to change, a change in perception must be experienced. And I think that's one of the reasons that the universe is changing our perceptions or messing with our perceptions, is that it wants us to change our behavior. It wants us to change our behavior based on perceiving the fundamental oneness of things, so we act different towards each other and nature. And perception changes our brains. So I think this other perception is one of the mechanisms that the mind uses the brain to create itself. So in a way, this is like an action of the universal mind trying to be created through us by changing our perceptions to change our brain to act differently, to create in alignment with the universal mind. And I was thinking about the 4 biotypes of bipolar. I might have talked about them a long time ago. It seems like those are the different pathways of metabolism that are involved in the bipolar phenomena arising, which is the other perception. Because I talked about how one can take a lot of different vitamins, maybe in certain cases, to relieve the effects of bipolar perception. But I'm also wondering, that's like medicating one back to reality. So I feel like it's also important to have those perceptions and maybe use vitamins and stuff to tone them down. But the point is that these perceptions are coming through because the universe wants us to perceive in this way, to behave in a different way. So it's important to be able to tone it down for sure. But what I'm trying to say is the 4 biotypes of bipolar aren't necessarily the 4 pathologies in pathways of metabolism of bipolar. They could be the 4 ways that the energy of the universe is changing genetics and genetic expression for those perceptions to occur. So those could actually be the changes in genetics that are needed as we move towards creating a different reality by seeing the underlying unity. So those could almost be like the pathways of unity in the biochemistry, because it's mirrored in the biochemistry. And I was thinking about how believing is recording. So the ego is sort of a recording mechanism, and believing something is recording according to the ego. A good question to ask is, who is the one that believes? And I was thinking about how language can be used for division in terms of the ego, abstracting me versus you, etc. Or it can be used for inquiry, and in inquiring into something, we're seeing into something which is perception, which is going to allow the brain to grow, which is learning. And perception of something new is required to rewire. And this is the opposite of habit. So habit prevents learning and neuroplasticity. And that could be part of the thing, actually, is that learning is neuroplasticity, and what is actually turned off through the process of our growing up as children is neuroplasticity itself. We get stuck in a few tape loops, and then there's very little neuroplastic change. And tied to that is beliefs. So if we believe things, we're not going to be seeing anything much different than our beliefs. And in map consciousness, there's a lot of perceptions that are pretty unbelievable. But perhaps it's important to not believe any of them, because any belief is going to limit future perceptions. And I feel like when one is transforming, one needs psychological safety in order to get through the psyche and to get beyond the psyche. Any psyche element is partly of the ego. And when it's scrambling, all that stuff is loosened up and broken apart and hard to make sense of. But I think a lot of it would be just letting those go as well. And in a way, this context creation with myself is like translating those experiences into English. Otherwise, it's just this non-mapped realm. So it's a way of map consciousness and putting it into English words. It's a domain, it's a dimension beyond English and language, but it's like translating that into English, translating it into language, creating a language to talk about it and understand it. And I wonder if it's talking about that sensitivity that we all have access to as human beings. And if we were in that sensitivity, how would we want to be received? And moving forward, how can we design our lives and society to be in alignment with that sensitivity? Because that sensitivity isn't even just human sensitivity. I've experienced sensitivity to animals and nature. So it's a sensitivity that's not just about humans, but also about Gaia. And in that way, it's sort of like speaking also a language of Gaia. Usually when we communicate, we're sort of speaking from our ego, like, oh, this is what I did today, that's what I did yesterday, blah, blah, blah. But we can speak from the perspective of the whole Gaia sphere. We can give voice to that, speaking from that sensitivity that we felt, that maybe we don't feel right now today, and it's a good thing, because it would make it very difficult to operate. But having that impression, having that vision of that sensitivity, it's still that way now. We're just not in that space where we're one with the sensitivity. But we were put in that sensitivity to come back and talk about that sensitivity. I heard this man talk at a day that I was at for work, and he was talking about making a difference in people's lives. And he was also talking about anything that suppresses the human spirit. And I didn't write down everything he said about that, but that part rung true for me in terms of how being labeled and diagnosed suppresses the human spirit. And it could be that sensitivity that we get in touch with is the human spirit, or is the Gaiac spirit, or a combination of both. And then we come back and we're trying to talk to people and we're really excited about this, and nobody else can sense it, and that suppresses the human spirit in general until one eventually collapses into the paradigm of, oh, you're mentally ill, when really one got in contact with that sensitivity of the human spirit and was crushed in that nobody else can feel it. And in saying that, I almost feel like the only real way to make some of this known is to connect with the sensitivity of the human spirit. And how does that happen without hoping and praying that everybody goes into manic consciousness and gets connected with that? I think that's where things like music come in, and it's possible that my path will go towards that. I'm not sure. And he talked about how kids learn by modeling and observation, and also approach avoidance. And I feel like that's sort of how we are in map consciousness. We're sort of like relearning, reality testing. I wonder, in saying reality testing, is that how one can design one's life going forward, is sort of approaching something, and if it doesn't feel good, well, getting away from that. Approach avoidance again versus planning rationally and logically. Almost like, what would a child do? Would a child like this person? I think this is resensitized in part of the neuroemergent process. And generally, they respond to human suffering with meds, and this isn't what mends. I think what mends is connecting with people, and I hope I can connect with some people that are of the same neurotribe, because our brains sort of naturally are in sync, versus interacting with people who aren't so much in sync with that. I wonder if there would be a way to create a way to sort of know if somebody's in sync with that. I remember once experimenting with the Celestine insight, where if somebody gives you an insight, you give them $1 or $2 or something. And I totally did that, and somebody totally responded, and then I did it at the next table and the next table. I was at this little wellness fair, and I was sort of in that dimension of giving and receiving money for insight for a minute or two, and it was messed. It was like totally cool, but they totally knew what I was doing and responded. And the talk I heard, the man said the number one thing for outcomes, for helping people or whatever it was working on exactly what the person wants to work on. So working with someone, not giving something to someone to comply to. And when I think about my hospital stay in April, the doctor wouldn't collaborate with me. They were paternalistic and said, this is the medication you're going to be put on. And I was like, no. But it happened anyway. And that was not a good outcome at all. And then I was even thinking about it in terms of my own life. Like, what am I working on with myself that I really want to work on? And the job stuff I'm struggling with a bit. I find I can sit down and make these videos for sure. Other than that, it's mostly random, whatever. But if I was to design my life with exactly what I want to work on, I probably wouldn't want to work on the job. I'd work on these videos and other research stuff. I was also thinking about trans consciousness as this neural emergence, as thinking together. It's sort of thinking together with the universe, and then people who have thought together with the universe likely can think together in terms of thinking with the universe, because they've already experienced that thinking with the universe process. And I feel like this transformation is like random decontravisions. I talked about this before, I think, how the ego is sort of a contrivance. And in bipolar omnipolarity and trans consciousness and neuro reemergence, there's this random decontravision. It's decontriving us. I can't remember if it would be cool to create like a soteria without walls. If each one of us was a soteria, a safe space, a psychologically safe beacon. And the other part is making this relational. So it's one thing to support people and give psychological safety so they can transform, but it's another thing for them to harvest, practice, embody, move towards their mania, and share their visions and co-create visions together. Because I think that's the gift that the universe is trying to give us when it allows us to see in this trans-conscious way So to only heal one's personal self, that is important in order to move about the world in an embodied manic way or a trans-conscious way, to co-create something different. And that's really acknowledging the altruism, which is the oneness. When we feel the oneness, we feel naturally altruistic. And it's not even a concept of, oh, I'm being altruistic. It's just a byproduct of seeing the fact of how things actually are. So how do we make it so it's actually that way? Well, we need to actually embody the concept of altruism until it becomes something that's no longer conceptual. People don't actually conceptualize their egos because they see it as who they are, like fundamentally who they are. Part of the context that I'm creating is to see that that is a false structure and it should be related to in that way. And if it was related to in that way, if a person broke down, they wouldn't be diagnosed with a mental illness, they would be congratulated. I also came across the term neurotype. Reminds me of the term biotype. And it could be that biotypes are creating neurotypes or vice versa. And I feel like bipolar is a certain neurotype, but it also has a lot of neurotypes within it. So it's more like omnipolar. So bipolar sort of is a description how an ego would describe it, because they would say feeling good is good and feeling bad is bad. Well, there's a lot more to it than just feeling up and feeling down. It's not a dual thing, really. But if we are looking at it with the consciousness of the ego duality, then it seems like, oh, the person's either up or they're down. But the thing is, when a person is supposedly up, that process in itself is omnipolar. It's all over the place. It's creative. It's learning. And there's no, like, learning is learning and creativity is creativity. And you can see that as good. You can see that extra energy as good. But it's not just up, is what I'm saying. And so it's all over. It's creative and it's designed to be that way. That's real learning. Learning isn't sitting in a desk in a classroom. We can learn by remembering stuff, or we can learn by actually creating. Imagine if our life was designed that each step we take, we could bump into something that we would create. We would perceive and we could see what we could create out of it. I feel like these new neural networks are for the age of love. We've been in this age of ego consciousness, of duality, of reason. And I actually feel like it's trying to usher in the age of love. And if you look at Dr. David Hawkins' scale of consciousness, the level of love is 500, I believe. Reason is 400 to 500. So there's this thing happening where we're trying to transcend reason. And it seems very unreasonable. It seems like a mental illness because somebody is not reasonable anymore. But really their consciousness is pushing into the level of love. And even if it only does so temporarily, it gives one a vision from love, which is oneness and altruism, and is trying to connect us to that altruism, which is love. And that would actually connect our brains in such a way that we see that we are all each other. I think that's part of the mirror neuron hyperactivity, is that our brains really are connected to that altruism, which is the fact of oneness, which is the fact that what we do to each other, we do to ourselves. And it shows us a lot of insights beyond reason, and we're able to know things by looking and loving and learning and in the state of joy. And maybe that's where true learning is, because when we're really in the state of joy, we don't really need reason as much. We can utilize reason, but it's not the fundamental value of life. It's not the prevailing level of consciousness. And that's part of why I'd like to transcend the system, in order to integrate in the state of love instead, because it's more powerful than being in this state of trying to reason things out. Like, I could sit here and like think of all these facts for the rest of my life and try to reason it out, or I could be in the state of love and operate from that, and I don't really know what would flower from that. I can't say, because it's not a reasonable thing, it's not a logical thing. So I have to let go of the logic to say, this process that was initiated in consciousness is the love of the universe. And I'm part of that. And I can abide in that if I let go of the need to rationalize things. And I think part of this transformation is actually a brain growth process, and it's when the brain grows in this way, in this neuro re-emergent way, there's growing pains. There's these other ego things that come up into consciousness that are from the past, that are stuck in our body, that we sort of need to let go of in order to be able to go into that state of love. And it's an interesting process, because if one can actually forgive those bits as they come up, one naturally gets closer to the state of love. Whereas if one actually identifies with them, it's going to bring one down to that level of that thought or that memory or that piece of karma. And that's usually what happens for me. I get to that state of love, but I hit a wall, and then I go all the way down to shame, like boom, in an instant pretty much. And then I have to start again and go all the way up the scale again. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's painful. I guess it would be ideal if I could go through that process of going back to shame and coming back up without going to the hospital. Because that could just be how consciousness works in this process, at least. It's not a static thing, like even how I seem pretty static in these videos talking to myself. I know I could end up on different parts of the spectrum of consciousness at any time. And again, I feel like it's like recalibrating and almost giving me those experiences of those other parts of the consciousness scale in order to keep my mind screen open to all possibilities. And even remind me of, if I see something that resonates with that, then maybe I'm heading in the wrong direction. So I feel like these brain structures that resensitize are starting to connect us with each other to actually co-create, and that the brain is outgrowing the ego. It's very limited, and it does stay intact to some extent, but when those other areas of the brain come back into play, and that could be one of the key terms, come into play. It's trying to get us to be playful, to play with words, to play with learning. That's how we learn, is by playing. I feel like this transconscious process is the universe seeding its vision. We saw it, and it provides an imprint for which us to actually approach or avoid things that are not of that vision. And I've talked before about how there's a lot of abilities and abilitation that happens through the process of bipolar, and it's not acknowledged. And these are the neuro-emergent strengths, And they're not seen that way because it's not seen as neuroemergence, it's seen as a mental illness. And I think that, again, we sort of become like our own applied kinesiological sensors. And so this is the approach avoidant thing in reality versus sort of thinking and planning things out. We have to rely on our sensors in the moment. And I feel like we go over the prevailing level of consciousness in order to get a bird's eye view of what needs to happen, a vision of what needs to happen. And part of what needs to happen is we need to talk about what needs to happen, because even what one sees in those states is not necessarily what needs to happen. What needs to happen is we need to get together and really communicate in this way. And I really feel like love grows brain cells. And our ego words actually are in opposition to that. So our brain actually shrinks. Probably being told one has a mental illness causes the brain to shrink, because if one was in a hyper learning state and then comes back and just is told it's all mental illness, they won't necessarily allow their brain to go back into hyper learning because they're busy verbalizing about themselves in a pathologizing way. And I think transconsciousness and bipolarity is the universe seeding its vision. It seeds its vision into our consciousness in more than one of us, but we actually need more than one of us to actually grow those seeds. And that could be part of it, is that if it's a transconsciousness thing, if it's something related to oneness, then it would take more than one person in order for that to grow, because one person trying to do it is like an ego trying to do it. Whereas if two people are working together, that is going to be the power that allows that to grow. And it could need two people working together to make it to grow as sort of a protective mechanism, so one person can't use that vision as like a power over others. And it likely needs a lot more than two. It needs a lot more than one of us saying, this is how the world really works, this is how the universe really works, these are the fundamental laws and principles of the universe. And they talk a lot about the laws of physics, but they don't talk about the laws of the human nervous system. And transconsciousness is trying to show us that stuff, how we're all one and we're designed to work together and collaborate, not mentally separate each other from ourselves and shrink our own brains and turn ourselves into biomachinery habits. And the thing I haven't really said much about, but it's implied, is that this can be a lot of fun.